Hi everyone, and welcome to the video podcast for Security Magazine, sponsored by Cijax. I'm joined, of course, today by Lisa Forte and Philip Ingram. Now, we're into a really weird season in a lot of countries, but we're going to be focusing our efforts today on sort of taking a look at the UK election that is coming up, cyber aspects to it, as well as the actual geopolitical impacts, if any, on this particular election cycle. But we, of course, are doing it in the context of the American ridiculousness that we've seen unfold in New York with the, I would say, the now guilty verdict on 34 felony counts in the state of New York. So let's start with the UK election, and I'm just going to situate it right now. It's showing a 20+% lead in the polls for the Labour government, but our analysis here at this table and sort of the pre-show chat indicates that might be a really soft number. Let's talk about it in real terms, Lisa. What are your feelings around, are we closer to a more balanced outcome, or is it going to be a runaway Labour government?
I think it's very difficult to tell, and I think typically when you base a lot of your assessments off of what has happened at local elections and by-elections, it tends not to be correct. It doesn't tend to work that way. Historically, we've seen in the United Kingdom that people tend to vote in a sort of anarchistic, protesty way in those elections, and then in the general election default back to largely what they had done before. I do think that it's probably a lot more flexible. I've seen in a number of safe seats, I'm from Bristol, in Bristol, some of the margins, Labour seats, historically safe seats for Labour across Bristol, but their actual percentage by which they won those seats back was significantly lower, actually, than it has been historically, with the Lib Dems and the Greens making some ground. I think in the UK generally, the sentiment is largely apathy. I think there's a big feeling of everything, all of the choices are awful, I'm not sure I want to bother, which I think is kind of sad.
and I think for those that are going to bother, there's an appetite for a change. They don't care whether that change is going to be better or worse than what's in at the moment. They just want change. And there's a difference between the last election where there was a big swing, but that was caused by two factors, the Boris factor and the Corbyn factor. The Corbyn, extreme left in his views. Keir Starmer with Labour Party is pushing that element of the Labour Party out from being candidates in this election. The Boris factor brought in what we refer to often as the red wall seats, so seats that were traditionally Labour voting, but they liked Boris's approach to Brexit, they didn't like Corbyn's approach to everything, and therefore they voted Conservative and brought Conservative MPs back in again. The effort that's coming out of Labour at the moment will suggest that those seats will turn back to their traditional Labour alignment with Keir Starmer, because he's brought the Labour Party much more into the centre. The longer term implications of that for him haven't quite played out yet, but I agree with Lisa, it's too close to call.
Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to sort of address right now is the relevancy. So what we've seen is before the election, we saw a lot of external activity of the UK in international relations. Now, of course, during a national election, most of that is now inward facing and whatnot. I'll start with Phil. Does the UK, in terms of its world importance, if you will, is there anything at stake in this election in terms of the direction of travel with the UK?
Not with the statements that are coming out from both parties. So we know where the Conservatives are because they've been in power for 14 years. Labour, from an international perspective, have come in and said they will support the UK's position on Ukraine, they'll support UK's position supporting Israel against the Hamas in Gaza, they'll support UK's position supporting the United States and the other 10 international countries that have got an international naval alliance in the Red Sea, trying to protect international shipping routes and everything else. So the indications are there's not going to be a massive change in what's going on. And people keep knocking the UK and the UK's position. We have to remember that the UK is the 5th or 6th largest economy in the globe. It is one of the permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, and therefore with that post comes global responsibilities. It's one of the few nations in the world that can, from a military perspective, power project. So pick up a military capability, take it somewhere and do something with it. And they've done that before on numerous occasions. It's probably number 2 behind the United States in that capability. The only other countries that have the ability to do that are France to a degree, Italy in a very tiny way. China is growing that capability enormously. Japan has got a burgeoning but tiny capability in it. India is developing it, and that's it.
I want to put a little note on that, because what I want to do is turn to Lisa and say,
I want to
okay,
put a tiny note before you turn to Lisa.
Okay.
So the only thing I disagree with, which Phil just talked about, was citing the UK's position as a veto member of the Security Council as in any way equating to power or influence, because if you look at the other permanent members, I mean, we have Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not going so well. So,
I was coming at it more from a moral responsibility perspective.
But Russia's not really like that.
But Russia doesn't do it, and China doesn't do it. So China hasn't supported international United Nations operations around the world by supplying troops to wear the light blue beret. Russia has. But not to the same degree. There's always been Russian interest in it, and it's always been seen to be the US as the big world policeman, supported by the UK, and France comes in and supports UN operations all over the world. But again, from a very French interest. I think sitting on there, all 5 nations should be pulling together and helping the world develop, instead of the animosity that we've got between the different groupings that are in there.
That I agree with. I think we see the US and the UK as the global policeman.
Yeah.
I don't think that's how China sees it, and I definitely don't think that's how Russia sees it.
I agree with you.
I have to say, and again, I want to park that, because we'll come back to the idea of force protection and what the UK can or can't do. What I wanted to ask, though, of Lisa is, given sort of the fact that both parties are publicly sort of saying the same thing about the issues at hand, is this kind of muting the chances of disinformation from activists, that might want to externally influence the UK election? Is there anything to gain?
So I think one of the big problems is actually the conduct of the political parties here in the UK impacts the ease at which other countries can interfere with the election. And the reason for that is that I actually think that overall the conduct of the 2 main parties here in the UK has not been good. And I think a lot, and I know you've spoken about this, Phil, as well, a lot of it has been very clickbaity, it's been very childish, it's been sort of memes and just kind of descended into quite a childish way of debating political issues and trivializing really serious political issues, actually. And I think what that does is it opens a door then for exploitation from other countries and other groups.
Yeah.
And I think what's really interesting, there was a report, and I'm sure we'll come on to this a bit later, but a report that was put out by Demos, who are a think tank here in the UK, on whether or not UK election rules ought to be changed to incorporate rules about the use of AI and about the use of sort of synthetic content going out on platforms. Because, for example, just very quickly, in October, there was a deepfake video, you probably remember it, it was all over Twitter, on Keir Starmer allegedly abusing a member of his staffing team, right? And this video was put out just before the Labour Party conference, and it spread enormously. It wasn't real. It never happened. So again, when people say there's absolutely no impact of AI on democratic processes, well, there is. It erodes trust in what you're reading, which may not get you to vote a different way, but it might mean you don't vote.
Yeah. Right. Well, I agree completely. And the malign actors that are out there are looking at the ease with which they can influence what's going on and try and adjust people's thinking and therefore voting or lack of voting to create more division to cause more disruption after the election with whatever government that comes in. So create as much unrest or potential for unrest as possible, and to support those elements that have got more extreme policies, that whether those be international policies and cause frictions elsewhere. And I agree completely with Lisa. The way our politicians are approaching this enables that, because we've got politics by soundbite, not substance. We're not seeing detailed arguments in anything that's coming out. And actually, when you then examine those soundbites are politically spun for the policies of the colour of the party that is putting them out. Now, if you've got a soundbite that's spun, it means it's not accurate. If it's not accurate and it's been deliberately put out for political effect, it's disinformation. We've got politics by disinformation. That's wrong. And the likes of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are sitting there going, hey, this is brilliant. But it's not just them. We're also seeing the influence then that's coming in we look at the Israel-Hamas conflict that's going on, and we look at the statements that are coming out from Hamas and the way that's getting into the disinformation sphere and the political effect that that's having across the globe with the protesters protesting on behalf of the Palestinian people. Well, they're only doing that because of what Hamas is saying and highlighting and everything else, and what Israel is not allowing the international press to do, to hold to account, and what Israel is doing as well. But it's being exploited. That is having an impact back on Israel again, but it's also having an impact on domestic politics. And we've seen that happen day after day after day, and that's being exploited. And others can see it, and they're going, oh, let's reinforce that. And that's happening.
I want to approach what you just said sort of with two prongs. So in the one sense, when we talk about the United Kingdom's defense-ready posture, we constantly hear our own people saying that we're unprepared, we're unfunded, the Trident missile demonstration / test didn't go according to plan is kind of embarrassing. Like, we are our own, propaganda at that point. On the other side, and this is, sort of what Lisa, follows, is we've seen some remarkable success by the NCA in tackling, both the fraudsters, money launderers, and cyber criminals that have been victimizing the business. So there's sort of like a not so great story. There's a good news story. My concern is these are being political stories, in that the idea here is that, are we sending a message to the likes of Putin and Xi Jinping that we're, not nearly ready for a conflict as part of a bit of a disinformation strategy of our own, and of course celebrating the success of taking down these botnets and, now actively trolling cyber criminals makes for some great headlines. What do you guys think?
Well, I think from a security perspective, therefore taking the criminal gangs down and using national technologies and international relationships to do that has been extremely successful. But I think what the war in Europe between Russia and Ukraine has highlighted is that we have been bluffing ourselves, and not just in the UK, but the US and European nations and other, bluffing ourselves as to our true defence capability. Now, I'd argue we've always done that. We've always bluffed ourselves that we've got enough ammunition. We've bluffed ourselves that our defence manufacturing capability can stand up and produce what's needed. And Ukraine has highlighted it can't. Now, that's a good thing, because we're not directly involved in conflict at the moment. So if we learn that lesson and increase the capacity, if is the biggest word in the English language, but we learn that lesson and increase our capacity in our defence industrial base and integrate our defence industrial base into our wider defence thinking and planning and all the rest of it, it will be expensive, but it's better preparation. I think Vladimir Putin is suddenly going, oh my goodness, I've allowed them to highlight this weakness, and they're fixing that weakness before I get into direct conflict. So every year that goes on, the West will get stronger and Putin's ability to influence it will get weaker. So we're in an unstable period of time at the moment where the Russian defense industrial base has ramped up very, very quickly indeed, and is working quite hard, supported by the Chinese, Iranian, and elsewhere. The Western defense industrial bases are slowly but surely increasing capacity. And then when it comes to actually defense capability, a lot of countries haven't really thought about that. They don't seem to be doing anything to increase their defence capability enormously outside the Baltic nations and Poland and those that are right up against the front line at the moment. The other nations are not increasing defence capability the way that I would expect them to be doing, given the potential threat that's out there and the length of time it takes to get done. It's not something you turn on overnight. It takes minimum 2 to 5 years to start to produce the number of armoured vehicles, the number of aircraft, the number of helicopters that would be needed, and to recruit and train the number of people and get them a basic level of experience to be able to man all of this.
Well, we have the battle group of Canadians in Latvia who are specializing right now in drinking and womanizing in preparation for...
Canadians have always done that. There's no real military capability. That's it.
It could be the reason we're actually in NATO. But Lisa, we got a glimpse of the true capabilities of GCHQ, the NCSC, in that they're leaning forward, following on the American strategy of kind of taking the fight to the cyber enemies.
Well, the NCA, not the
NCA, yeah. Yep. And they're dismantling the cyber criminal infrastructure. Some have proven more resilient than others. But it does lend itself to, if they're unleashing this capability publicly on cyber criminals, what are they doing on nation states, right? Is it tit for tat cyber right now with, the revelations of these massive nation state cyber attacks, in quotations? Sometimes it's just exploitation and implant for espionage purposes. Other times it's more destructive, potentially. How do you see this evolving?
So I think it was, on the surface, successful. However, we have also seen that whilst disruption is positive against these cyber criminal groups, it doesn't deal a lasting blow by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, the first time they took Lockbit down, they were down for 4 days.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly good to disrupt stuff, but it doesn't really net effect do anything. I think what we're really poor at in the UK is supporting our companies and our infrastructure and getting people prepared for how you'd handle a cyber attack. And actually coming back to your point about how prepared we are from a sort of military kinetic warfare perspective, it's the same sort of thing. I work in that space, and I often see companies say, yeah, we're fine, we've got this, we've got that. When you actually test it, you don't have it. You can't spin it up as quickly as you think. You can't recover as quickly as you think. And I think there's always this sort of, it's almost arrogance of sort of thinking, it will be fine. If it happens, I'm sure it'll be fine. And it tends not to be. And like you said, that's exactly what we've sort of fallen into with this situation. Well,
and this is, I think, a flaw for the wider security industry. The measurement of success for the best cyber program or security program and others is nothing happens.
Right.
And therefore, when you're trying to get into a board and get them to run the exercises to test everything, they're going, well, nothing's happened. Why should I? Well, no, that's successful. And then when something does happen, they suddenly go, well, why has this happened? We've spent all this money on all this. Why has that happened? Well, you've never actually practiced to make sure that it works and everything else. And that's part of the problem that there is, I think.
I don't know if this happens at national level. I'm sure you'll be able to tell me. But in company level, what I actually see happening is actually our fault as security practitioners. We oversell the tools we have to the board, and we go, this, pay for this, and it will do all of this amazing stuff. Yeah. It's not capable of doing that. Yeah. And then when push comes to shove, the board think, well, we've bought this tool that saves everything. Can we not just use that? And then all of a sudden it's, it doesn't work like that, or it's going to take 3 weeks.
And that does happen at national level and international level. A classic example is the debacle of Afghanistan. Donald Trump, president, you're looking after the US taxpayers' budgets and all the rest of it, saying, why am I spending $1 trillion a year in Afghanistan? General, how are the Afghans doing? How are we doing in our military operation? And US General says, Mr. President, we're doing this. The Afghans are brilliant. We've trained them to do this. We've equipped them to do that. We've got them to do this. And the president then says, well, why am I spending $1 trillion of US taxpayers' money if you're saying that they're capable of doing this themselves? Okay, we'll withdraw. And then the generals suddenly go, oh, well, and they then don't say, if we withdraw, the only reason why they're able to do that is because we're there motivating them, providing the logistics support for their equipment, providing the ammunition that's there, providing the backbone for them to go out and do things. And if we withdraw, it'll all collapse. That wasn't part of the original briefing. and people don't have the moral courage then to turn around and say, I was bluffing you beforehand. And it's this policy of politics or briefing by disinformation, by sound bites, by being positive, by no bad news to the boss. That is something that reflects industry and reflects what goes on at national politics and international
and
politics.
that comes to what you're saying. I mean, these wins are political opportunities this year. And that's the problem, because this year it's all about the general election in the UK.
Yeah.
And once you've had the general election, it's about getting the new party, getting their feet under the table, blah, blah, blah. So in terms of like progress this year as a country, it's zero, because it tends to be in election years for any country, right? And so I think a lot of these things end up getting like, look how well we're doing. You know, that's the Tory angle. And the Labour angle is we're not doing very well here, but we've got this magical solution that's going to fix it all like that. And the Tories haven't thought of it. And so both parties are just basically pumping out nonsense.
Yeah.
And the British people are stuck in the middle going, I don't really know. I have so much scepticism about the democratic process that I don't even know whether it's worth voting.
So two things come to mind when you said that, spewing out sort of ridiculous things. Now, the big side kind of that took everybody by surprise was Rishi Sunak announcing a national service program. This conjured up the patriotic response of the United Kingdom and conjured up the sort of, I'm going to say, Winston Churchillian, let's all pull together because Britain is really in it deep.
Your country wants you.
Your country wants you, or actually your country's going to tell you. As the case may be. Phil, your spin on this, is national service something that there's an appetite for in the United Kingdom?
And can I add one question onto that?
Yes.
Phil? Does it make you look weak? Does it make you look like your armed forces aren't up to the job?
Well, you know, our armed forces are under strength at the moment anyway. National service per se, in the traditional sense where everyone has to do national service and it's primarily military related, is bad for the military because it turns the military from being a professional military capability into a professional training sausage machine.
Mm-hmm.
Well, conscripts, really.
Well, exactly. But this proposal is not that. We've got 750,000 18-year-olds in the country. They're only talking about 30,000 going into the military for a year, and they have to volunteer and be selected to go in. That will fill a lot of the gaps that are in there and provide a number of people back out into society with a basic level of military training, military discipline and everything else that would be good for the country, and also set the conditions so that if, and we are on a path to potential global conflict, if that came to fruition, you've got people partially trained that if you do have to call them up again, you only have to add a smaller package on to get them up to capability of going to the front line. The other element of it, but that's 30,000 out of 750,000. The other 720,000 have to do 12 weekends of volunteering for different good organisations around the country, whether that be the lifeboat service, the ambulance service, into healthcare, St John's Ambulance and other things. That's not very onerous, and actually would give people an extra sense of purpose, see other people outside their immediate circle, give some skill sets that would be useful for business and elsewhere, and it's not onerous in any way, shape or form. So the theory behind what was announced and the way it was is brilliant, but the cynic in me says it was rolled out very quickly indeed as a political policy to put something sensational out rather than it being thought through, because if they'd thought it through, it would have been put out beforehand. And that's where it's detracted from the whole thing.
I feel like it pandered to the base of the Tory party a little bit too obviously.
And I also think that with a lot of these things, I think it's actually wrong to say that only people who are typical Tory voters would have that level of patriotism. I think you see that across British society, actually. Yeah. But I think one thing that a lot of British people want to see is a bit of give and take. It's not that perhaps they're against that policy. It's that, okay, but then we've got trains that don't work, and we've got hospitals that are underfunded, and our roads are full of potholes. So can we have, it's got to be a bit of a give and take between the elected and the electorate.
Yes.
I think we'll park that one there, because I think that's it sort of leads to the next one about sort of craziness in UK politics. So
it's not crazy, it's perfectly logical and everything else.
Sure. I think there's a real trust problem on both sides, but is it a bit exacerbated because under the Tory watch, you had the scandal of the post office, you have this scandal, Partygate, and this is something that they don't remind us on the television, that Rishi Sunak was found to be as guilty as Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson lost his job as the Prime Minister as a result of it. And that Sunak was guilty of the exact same offense. Parking that aside, when you make announcements such as the Tory party did with regards to, a $2.5 billion gift or tax reduction for pensioners, again being the Conservative vote, it seems that there's a trust issue. It doesn't seem like the Tory party is out for the common good of the people. I also think that the problem with Keir Starmer is he has Sir in front of his name, so it's not like it's coming across like he's going to be of the people. He's at an elevated position no matter how you slice it. So the outcome of this election, if we sort of go with the parties we trust the least, are we looking at potentially a coalition, a government, in which case, who's going to hold the balance of power?
Personally, just pure opinion, I hope that's the outcome. I suspect and hope that it will be Labour who is invited to form a government, having won the most number of seats but not an overall majority, and then forms a coalition with one or other party, which I think provides a more balanced view, especially in the time that we're in now, where there's a lot of competing interests in the UK, and it's quite a segmented society, actually, more so than it's been historically. I think that would be the best way to represent the electorate.
Let's go with that theory for a moment, because I'm going to pitch this to. Does that now show a clear path to Northern Ireland, or to unification in Ireland, and a Scottish exit scenario?
There's a lot to unpick in all of this. I think, going to your original question, part of the problem that there is behind both parties is, as I mentioned earlier, it's politics by soundbite. So sensational soundbite, and to be sensational, it's not telling the full truth. It's got a spin, and therefore it's politics by disinformation. Whilst we have both sides slugging each other out with disinformation, then we're never going to get to the real truth.
Yeah.
When we look at some of the policies that come out, and the biggest policy that will affect Scotland, Northern Ireland, the SNP are toast in this election. It's whether Labour, the Tories, or Lib Dems take over Scotland, but the SNP and their nationalist agenda will disappear for at least this next Parliament. And that shows where parties get fixated on a single issue over and above all of the local issues that people want to deal with. And then you bring in a bit of corruption. We're getting that single issue with Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland. And then Sinn Féin don't take up their seats in Westminster. So a vote for Sinn Féin is a wasted vote because they can't do their job and they can't represent the totality of their constituency. We have to remember that in a democratic society, someone is elected as the representative of their constituency with a minority of the electorate voting for them, but they just happen to get the most number of votes of any of the other candidates. But once they're elected, they should represent everyone, no matter what their political colouring is. And if you don't then take up your seat, you're not representing everyone, you're following a minority stance that's in there. The biggest policy that will lead potentially to the breakup of the United Kingdom, I think, is Keir Starmer's policy of giving the vote to 16-year-olds. Because if you look at 16-year-olds in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, they tend to be more nationalistic in their view. They tend to be much easier influenced because they don't have the life skills to put into context what has been put in, so they will react from an emotional perspective. And if you are trying to convince people to vote one way or the other purely on emotions, it's easier to manipulate. And therefore you'll find that the growth in nationalism in both areas will go through the roof, and therefore it will lead to a much greater potential for a united Ireland and for Scotland after the next election when there's a referendum again, to properly break away from the United Kingdom. That would, it'll destroy the United Kingdom. It would destroy, you get Great Britain minus, so it would be just Britain of England and Wales, and the Welsh will be going, we don't want to be part of this, and it would be a disaster for the country, a complete disaster.
But yet, the sovereign would remain. Social media, then, is this going to be a decisive factor in influencing the vote and getting out the vote, engagement, or is sort of like the standard sound bites that we get across the news agencies really the way the message is going to be delivered?
No, I think nowadays the fight is fought on social media, and that's why you see parties going so big on Twitter, on Instagram, on these platforms, because that's how they engage with the electorate. That's how they get their message out largely. I think there are two problems to that. The first is social media platforms and how they regulate, monitor, police on some level the content that goes out, which has typically been poor to very poor. And I know Facebook, for example, has now pulled away from it completely and said that they are not going to be putting out news at all because essentially we can't police this, we don't want it appearing. The other side to that, I think, are the AI companies. And there's been, and going back to that paper that Demos put together, they were saying, maybe there needs to be rules that during election time, content that has been created on an AI platform gets watermarked by default, so people can identify it. But again, they're not going to really want to do that because if your image that you've made on whatever AI platform has a watermark across it, in some way identifying it as such.
And again, if you've got countries that are trying to manipulate the messaging, and it's much easier whenever you get big data and your analysis of big data and your messaging has been put out over social media to produce targeted messaging to affect people's views on different places and target directly into them, into their own devices, so you can change the way people are thinking. Countries that want to influence that will have their own AI capability that won't watermark it or anything else, so people will then go, oh, that could be genuine, and will influence what's going on. I think
that's true, but I do also think that there's sort of three players in the disinformation/AI game, which are the political parties here in the UK, then nefarious actors who we don't really know, and then nation states who we can anticipate would want to influence it. These two, you can't really pass, as you said, you can't really pass any rule or legislation or regulatory document here in the UK that's going to stop that. Fine, that's a different topic and a different fight. But in terms of getting the political parties here in the UK to agree on conduct on social media and agree on the use of AI or not the use of AI, I think is crucial. And I'm a little bit surprised, given the Bletchley Park conference that they had on AI, where we were trying to pitch ourselves as leaders in this field, that we've then shied away from any mention of it in our election rules, knowing full well that this was an election.
But our political parties agree something beforehand that they want to then abuse for their own purposes.
Well, exactly.
This is sort of the inherent hypocrisy of the democratic system that's limited to the 4 or 5 year term, in that you're 100% right. One of the issues that I personally have is the global climate change problems 100%. Associated with the amount of energy that AI consumes. Ergo, if we are going to be the leading AI, we are going to be burning fossil fuels, coal, and as much solar and wind energy and wave energy as well, in order to feed the AI beast. This disenfranchises. And you would think that a country that is an island, that if sea level rises, we will have impacts, basically 360 degrees around the country. So it seems odd that we're so insular during the election cycle where we're talking about policies to affect, the people in Grimsby or
Grimsby.
Grimsby.
is way better though.
It is much better. We've renamed it. We'll rename it.
Grimsby.
But we're talking about policies, that affect the kind of like a population of that small town, but we're not discussing the fact that we've had a horrific impacts of climate change with, at one point, our national treasured bog historic area caught on fire. You would think that would be a wake-up call. We've had record flooding, we've had coastal erosion. All of these issues don't even seem to be part of the agenda. Yeah,
and
I guess.
This is the problem, because the Tories, they want to go for the whole, we're going to be the leaders in AI. This is cool. This is making us look like we're creating all these opportunities. Labour actually pulled out of a lot of the climate commitments. They've actually said they're not going to honour those climate commitments. So it's almost like, well, that's boring. That's old news. We need to come up with new shocking things, like let's say national service, and let's say we're going to do this, and let's say we're going to do all these weird and wonderful things, which again comes back to our original point of this disinformation politics that we've got into, and how now my attitude, you were talking about some of those things, about like the 16-year-old votes, for example. I look at that and I honestly think they're never going to do that. And that's the point that I've got to with politics personally, where I just have this skepticism of anything, which is equally tragic for democracy, really.
And that ties into how people are going to vote. They're going to vote, we want change. Surely they can't be worse than the current Shah, because they're really bad. The reality is they could be worse than the current Shah, and even worse. They might not be, but voting on hope only rather than substance is not good for democracy.
What do you guys think? So we're going to sum up sort of what we've done here, but what do you guys think about what could really change the election? Should the UK government decide to declare war on the talking animals of Madagascar to stir up patriotism? We'll send our two aircraft carriers down to deal with that threat, or do we go and find a major world issue and commit resources to that world issue? What do you guys think could upend this and make it a more interesting conversation?
Well, typically, countries around the world create an adversary who's a big threat to mobilize support, right? That's typically the MO. We've seen US, Putin, all of us do it. We all see it. So that's typically the way it goes. But I think, given that we've got, a month until voting day, until polling day, I think there's not going to be anything that big. So I think what you'll actually see is just a load of clickbait nonsense get pushed out. God knows where it will go. I remember back in the last election where Corbyn suddenly started talking about free internet for everybody or something. And you thought, what are you on about? So this is the kind of thing it will descend
into mediocrity.
Both parties just talking absolute nonsense and probably making the situation worse in the country in terms of voter turnout, which historically in the UK has been terrible.
Yeah.
So an optimistic view from Lisa.
Always. You come to me for the optimism.
And I have to agree with that level of optimism. The problem behind not planning, and neither the parties have planned, which is why you're seeing all these random policies coming out.
Well, certainly I see you calling these people out on Twitter on a daily basis.
Well, exactly. Is that
what's the plan?
What you haven't got are the implications of what it is that you're putting out, and thought through the second and third order implications and how that's going to affect things. And that's a disaster. Like Lisa, I don't think there's time for anything big to come out. We can't get the Argentinians to go and reinvade the Falkland Islands again. The Chinese have already taken over Hong Kong. We're stirring the Spanish up to try and do something in Gibraltar, but the EU might have something to say on that. Ireland is just being Ireland. The Russians haven't invaded Ireland yet. That could happen, but they're slightly tied up in Ukraine. So no, there's no time for a global disaster.
All right. Well, with that look, we are forecasting somewhat of a mediocre election and election campaign. We will be back next month, although we're going to be shooting that episode a little bit early to accommodate some summer travels. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.